Lumi în coliziune cu Radu Golban la Gold FM.
Bună ziua, doamnelor și domnilor! Bun venit la Radio Gold FM, aici live la emisiunea Lumi în coliziune pe 96,9 MHz. Astăzi vă invit la o discuție, ultima discuție de acest gen la Radio Gold FM, în cadrul emisiunii Lumi în coliziune, cu invitatul meu, cu domnul profesor James Giordano. Profesorul Giordano este neurolog și psihiatru la Universitatea din Georgetown, dar probabil unii dintre dumneavoastră au auzit deja de acest nume pentru că dânsul a anchetat sindromul Havana în calitate oficială, fiind membru a unei unități speciale a armatei americane pentru combaterea agenților biologici în cazul unui război biologic. Astăzi continui discuția cu el despre riscul unei pandemii mondiale provocată, declanșată de niște agenți patogeni toxici, și anume de prioni. Cum s-ar produce un astfel de război? De ce un astfel de război probabil ar avea o structură hibridă? Cine ar putea avea un interes pentru a declanșa un astfel de război? Ce înseamnă asta pentru noi? Cum ne putem proteja? Și cred că discuția cu profesorul Giordano ne va ajuta să înțelegem mai bine acest concept de pandemie geopolitică. Haideți să ascultăm ce ne va spune domnul profesor James Giordano.
Hello, Mr. Professor Giordano. Welcome to RadiogoldFM here live on Worlds in Collision on 96.9 MHz. How are you doing? Welcome to my talk show here on a beautiful Friday lunch. It's really a big honor to have you here in my talk show.
It's a privilege and honor to be here, sir. Thank you.
Is it your first time in Romania on air?
It is. Yes, sir.
Well, welcome. Mr. Giordano, you have quite an impressive background. I'd like to introduce you to our audience. You are a professor in the departments of neurology and biochemistry, chief of the Neuroethics Studies program, and chair of the project in military medical ethics of the Pellegrino Center for Clinical Bioethics at Georgetown University Medical Center. As well, you are also a J5 Donovan Group Senior Fellow, BioWare and Biosecurity at U.S. Special Operations Command. You served as Senior Science Advisory Fellow to the SMA Group of the Joint Staff of the Pentagon, as Research Fellow and Task Leader of the EU Human Brain Project subprogram on dual-use brain science, and as an appointed member of the Neuroethics Legal and Social Issue Advisory Panel of the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA. You're also an author of over 285 papers, 7 books, 210 book chapters, and 15 government white papers on brain science, ethics, and national defense, also an elected member of the European Academy of Science and Arts, and an overseas fellow of the Royal Society of Medicine. It's a really great honor to speak here with you in our talk show here at Radio Gold, Worlds in Collision.
The pleasure is mine, sir. Thank you.
For the first time, I must admit, I came across a few of your articles related to prions. Now, that's the 4th discussion here on Radio Gold about prions. And I was very impressed about your statements regarding synthetic bioweapon development and the threat and danger arising from prions. What could you tell us about prions? And in terms of biosecurity, our audience is meanwhile, as long as they have watched the last discussions, they are already quite familiar with prions. So we start right away with biosecurity aspects of prions.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there are 2 or 3 things that come to the forefront of awareness, and I would imagine preparedness and readiness, when we're looking at biosynthetics and biosecurity. The first is that the more progress we make and the more rapidly the developments occur in the range of bioscience and biotechnology, the greater the capability, the tools, techniques to be utilized for a variety of purposes, inclusive of those that may be fundamental in interests of national security, intelligence, and defense. That's the first point. The second is that national security, intelligence, and defense is focal to a nation's ideology, purposes, intents, motivation, and very often sustainment of multi-level power. And the third is that the techniques in science and technology aren't to be taken as standalone techniques, but rather fall into a larger rubric, which is referred to scientific convergence. The relative silos of disciplinarity tend to dissolve, and various forms of sciences can be taken together to be able to achieve various advancements, developments, new tools and methods in ways that heretofore increases both the pace of science as well as its scope. So if we take all of these factors together, what we see is that the growing capabilities of synthetic biology, genetics, various forms of big data use coupled with decision technologies for the internet of information have allowed capabilities that can be leveraged for a variety of goals and purposes. And one nation's idea of what is good and right to defend its people, its kin, and its kith may not necessarily comport with other nations. And as a consequence, it becomes important to therefore understand the underlying philosophies, ethics, politics, and power intentions that various nations manifest, particularly in the way that they utilize cutting-edge bioscience.
So that's somehow dealing with a so-called dual use. So on the one side, nations have done scientific research on synthetic prions, let's say, in identifying therapies against Alzheimer. But these synthetic prions might be also weaponized. Is that something you are referring to? Is that one aspect?
Well, I think yes, that's certainly one aspect. The other aspect is threefold. Not only can the prions themselves be weaponized, but approaches to mitigating or militating prion development could also be weaponized or at least leveraged. Let me give you an example. If we recognize that prion diseases, sorts of, for example, in animal species, what is referred to colloquially as mad cow disease, Creutzfeldt's disease in humans, Kuru, and perhaps other diseases, neurodegenerative diseases that may have a prion-like origin. Well, if we recognize that we can do treatments or preventions for prion-based disorders, then those nations that possess these treatments manifest a certain level of power because their capabilities can be then utilized in a variety of biomedical situations, agricultural circumstances to maintain global and public health against prion disorders. But the other issue is that realistically, the more data we have through big data as a force multiplier, coupled with copious, conspicuous, and ubiquitous use of various forms of decision technologies, machine learning, and AI, the more we can understand the genome, genetics, and phenotypics of not only the prions themselves, but particular individuals, both human as well as animal, that may have certain susceptibility to prions, whereby either synthetic or naturally occurring prions can be utilized in a disruptive way to affect human populations either directly or indirectly through disruption of agricultural chains and therefore the bioeconomy.
Yeah, there is also some research about the genetic susceptibility to prion disease. And I think the findings in Papua New Guinea about the Kuru people, that not all of them who were involved in endocannibalism suffered prion disease, showed that some people might have a susceptibility to prions and others not. Is that dealing at a certain extent to this polymorphism? I think with this genetic modification on codon 129, the people in Papua New Guinea, I read they have this G129V, and another favorable mutation is the M129V. Is that something which is also promising for prion disease? In terms of susceptibility?
I mean, if we can identify that there would. Yes, that's a good way to look at it. I mean, if we can address and acknowledge that there may be certain genomic, in other words, large populational genomic, as well as genetic and perhaps epigenetic factors that can prevent against not only the development of prions, but perhaps also prions within a living brain, well, then we may be able to harness those factors within the genome to more broadly create treatments that could be utilized to suppress prion-based diseases.
Now we'll go on talking about prion disease and also what sort of possible treatments there might be against prion disease or even in a prion pandemic. But I'd like to know at which extent is the notion of NBIC, nanobiological information and cognitive convergence, linked to synthetic biology and to synthetic prions. Is the synthetic prion something necessary for this sort of convergence the humanity would like to achieve? Or is it not linked to that at all?
No. I mean, what we're seeing is one small avenue, one very narrow niche in which synthetic, coupled to gene editing techniques and the ability to create precision pathogens, either by virtue of identifying the precise mechanism by which a pathogen can become more viable and therefore more capable within a population, and then using that information also to understand predispositions. That's actually a fairly narrow niche of synthetic biology, big bio data, and the use of genetic and epigenetic techniques. So the worry about prion, for example, is certainly present. It is a concern. There is vulnerability in prion structure and function that may yield the capability to be harnessed through synthetic biological and or gene editing type techniques. And in this way, these prions could indeed be rendered more viable and therefore, if you will, more virulent, more capable in particular populations. What this also infers, and some research has been very, very adamant about, is that the current language and parameters of the Biological Toxins and Weapons Convention must address and remain apace with new developments in the biosciences and biotechnologies that might be able to modify existing agents and make them more pathogenic, be able to make existing pathogens more precise and therefore more capable at disruption or destruction. In some cases, to actually synthesize agents of a variety of different sources, whether they are prion type anomalous proteins, viruses, bacteria, fungi, or toxins, brand new. So I think that what must be an important fact is that those oversight, surveillance, and regulatory mechanisms that are currently in place on the global stage must become aware and to remain capable with those abilities and those levels of bioscience has incurred. And I'm encouraged in that recent discussions within those committees of the Biological Toxins and Weapons Convention, as well as various European experts. And
so actually, in order to stop or to prevent
activity, state has become more focused on cutting edge. Yes.
So that's a strategy in order to prevent, if I got you right, the sort of coupling between a pathogenic biological agent to prions. which could actually generate, amplify disruptive effects in targeted individuals or groups. Like to quote you, like you said already,
that's correct.
2019 in article.
That's correct. Yes, sir.
How could such a prion pandemic actually look like? Would that be a sort of pandemic which would end someday, or would we have, in such a case, for instance, have to face severe changes in our way of the way we're working, what we're eating, the way we interact with each other? I think it might have severe consequences worldwide. It would be not necessarily something to isolate locally.
Well, I think with any form of disease that spreads to the epidemic level and then is not contained and becomes pandemic, there need to be certain controls. We've seen most recently with a number of epidemic outbreaks in Africa and with COVID. So changing individuals' biological, social, and psychological behaviors as a consequence of pandemic control will be very, very important. Now, of course, something like SARS-CoV, while having relatively high morbidity, in other words, a lot of people get sick, and initially relatively high, at the same time, mortality, I think was something of a wake-up call for urgency to develop strategies, mechanism, agency capabilities against global epidemic threats. Let me explain. More, we have to view the world as an entirety. In other words, what happens halfway around the world is going to be exceedingly relevant anywhere else on the globe because of technologized, capable travel and human spread. Point number one. Point number two is that something like a prion or prion-based diseases are far more of a long threat. In other words, they're far more strategically viable in terms of their threat than short term. If we examine something like COVID or perhaps other viruses, what we see is high contagion, rapid infection, rapid morbidity, debilitation in morbidity, and mortality. If we examine the prion diseases, modifiable degenerative diseases that perhaps could be leveraged and utilized for disruptive effects, at point in time, we know that this is really more of a long game scenario. Prions take quite a bit of time to induce their degenerative effects, on the order of years.
But synthetic
so
prions,
the actual effect of
they have a shorter time of incubation, up to synthetic, up to 500 days. I remember that I have read somewhere. So they might reduce.
Yes, but I mean, the incubation time does not. Correct, but still, the incubation time does not necessarily reveal the total time necessary to induce profound pathology. So we're still talking about an agent that has over a 1 year span of time for incubation to initial effect. Then the effect either be relatively rapid based upon the extent of the prion spread in the organism, or can be somewhat more graded. But you're still not looking at something that's going to have the rapidity of spread as you would, for example, a virus, bacteria, point that you made. Can prions be modified in such a way so to condense their incubation period, their infectivity, and perhaps their spread in biological tissues? And the answer to that question appears to be at least partly yes. So this then once again represents the turn in that understanding what synthetic biology can do provides an important basis for us to understand what we should do in terms of surveillance, oversight, regulation, and governance.
I actually found that you wrote quite a lot about security aspects of prions, it was also Stanford Professor Stephen Shove, and from Sao Paulo, Professor Almeida Xavier, but also another guest who attended my debate, my talk show, Mr. Professor Stephen Schlotzmann. Actually, he addressed the prions in a more science fiction manner, having written The Zombie Autopsies 2011. And Stephen pointed out that a theoretical risk for a zombie disease, as he said, might be when prions one day would be coupled to a virus. That would be the worst case scenario when such an apocalyptic situation might occur. Do you share his view or his thought? Is that the coupling which you also refer to?
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, the concern of prions is vectoring the prions into a population. How do we get the prions into the population? Prions themselves, as you know, have a high infectivity factor. They're very difficult to eradicate utilizing heat or chemical sources, so their liability remains high. However, if you increase their vectorability, in other words, if you increase their transmissibility, what you're essentially providing is a mechanism to increase the distribution and spread, and perhaps do so in targetable ways. So I share Professor's concerns in that other technologies, so for example, nanoengineering technologies allow for aerosolizable nanomaterials that can be used as chaperones or as micelles to encapsulate or to then vector some aspect of the entire prion or components of the prion, create what's called force multiplication. In other words, they increase the capability of prions to be able to be used in ways that are disruptive and or destructive to targetable populations.
Is that something dealing with the induction of prion disease by nanoparticle conversion related to electromagnetic field? I had 5 weeks ago Mr. Professor Hafez Abdemelek from the Carthage University, and he is doing in his scientific area of research, he is looking at PRP to PRP ST conversion via electromagnetic fields, how these nanoparticles might induce transmissible spongiform encephalitic disease. Is that one of the possible vectors as well, which is of concern in security matters?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that essentially paraphrases what I had just said, in that one of the things we're concerned about is that the use of multiple approaches and technologies can increase certain aspects of the disease's capability. And of course, as you know, since 2007, our research group was concerned about the liability and potential viability of utilizing nanomaterials and forms of nanoscientific engagement as vectors for a variety of different agents, inclusive of drugs that can be assembled in situ within the body, various forms of sensors, as well as transmitters, and certainly being used as scaffolds and or chaperones for various forms of microbial, viral, and in this case,
there are also a few studies related to because you mentioned COVID, and there are a few studies looking at a possible prion structure within the spike. So that's one study by George Tates, then another paper by Danish Idris and Vyaj Kumar. I think I pronounced their names properly, to Indian scientists. And they had a computer 3D type model of analysis, and they looked at the prion and they said on the spike, and they said that the highest score for the connection with the cell surface with the ACE2 receptor is due to the prion structure, and the docking score for the S1 prion was 285.39, which is much higher than any other of the scores related to this adherence molecular docking process of the virus region binding domain to the cell surface. Is that something scaring you?
Well, again, part of it is putting it into context. Prion-like structures as components of cells and prion-like structures as components of viruses are not unique to the SARS-CoV virus, certainly not to the one that causes COVID-19. A prion-like structure, in terms of the way a protein is folded, can create certain abilities within a virus and or within certain cells that then allow different aspects of what we call up or downstream protein metabolism. Prions, stable prions in living cells, create mechanisms for docking and communication within the cell. It is only when the prion structure becomes abnormal that it becomes essentially proliferate and therefore problematic. So it does not surprise me that there are prion-like structures in modifications to existing viruses that are going to mimic the communicability and transferability of those viruses to living cells, either by direct receptor docking or by membrane interaction. Now, what that tells us is that the more we know about prions and prion nature, and the more relatively ubiquitous we see the prion-based structure may be in healthy cells and non-healthy cells, the more we may be able to see that there is some evolutionary component of prion structure that may be influential to susceptibility and or prevalence of certain forms of neurodegenerative disorders and or certain forms of other disorders that can be manifest based on structural functional relationship.
Now, regarding the therapeutic chances to handle prion disease, there's also a lot of research related to that. I've written a paper by Professor Thomas Wisniewski and Fernando Goni about how immunomodulation could be used to prevent prion disease. And I found quite fascinating the concept of active anti-prion vaccination. But it's also a vaccination concept related to several adverse effects for the patients. One of the papers even said that repetitive anti-prion immunization is actually increasing the susceptibility to a prion disease. Are such therapies actually promising only for a certain period of time? Or is there something else we might expect in future which could be really safeguard us from prion disease? Expect the genetic susceptibility or rather favorable gene someone might have?
Well, that's a provocative question. I think it's a very good question because we're essentially asking for speculation about what could come down the pipe with regard to technological readiness level of vaccines. At this point, an active vaccination against prion disease has not been realized. Not to the extent that one would use a vaccine in broad scale treatment, either for livestock or for humans. Point number one. Point number two, identifying those processes by which prions will then essentially transfer or transform into a pathogenic variant, I think is one of the more important mechanisms that could be utilized for immunomodulation. In other words, if we can develop some form of an immunization rather than just sort of a treatment, an immunization allows the endogenous immune system to recognize initial changes, downstream changes in structure that would then be important to abnormal and pathogenic prion function. The ability to then get that level of immunological recognition early on, confer that and maintain that, would essentially arrest the transformative processes of prion structure to function transformation early before the expression of pathogenicity. And that is, as you've noted, one of the potential areas of immunomodulation therapeutics that is currently under research investigation.
Yeah, but a threat of a potential bioweapon using prions, actually the threat is defined by the fact that there is no real treatment against prion disease. Is that right? Otherwise, it had not been a potential threat if there was a
correct
a therapy.
There's no denying that any agent any agent for which there is little or no known treatment or intervention could be utilized to nefarious effect, prions among them. Would it be possible to weaponize a prion? It would be very possible to weaponize a prion. The easiest way to do that would be to take identified prion infect tissue from an animal and disseminate that tissue broadly among a human population. In other words, what you would essentially be doing is providing a spreading vector for what is colloquially referred to as mad cow disease, which then speaks very strongly to the need to, once again, oversee, regulate, and govern how prions are studied, and also how prion-infected tissue is handled, and what the provenance and the custodianship of such tissues entails, because you don't want prion-infected tissue getting into, quote, the wrong hands because of that very issue. Now, again, we're talking about non-synthetic prions. Could you or I or anyone else induce a spread of diseases simply by disseminating prion-infected tissues and meats? Yes, of course we could. Would that take a relatively long time to manifest a disruptive effect in a population? Yes, it could. Could synthetic prions be introduced in much the same way, where the synthetic with now a much shorter effect to pathology in a time period, be introduced into a target population and therefore be leveraged as weapons? Yes, absolutely. And that was one of our worries.
I'd like to know what determined you to say that such a scenario might be rather happen in case of a non-kinetic war and not a real kinetic war? Because those taking such an initiative, states or agents, would like to stay in the background so that they cannot be blamed for applying such or using such toxic agents. Is that one of the reasons?
Yeah, I mean, part of it goes into defining kinetic versus non-kinetic thresholds. And I think that there is a gray zone between them. Clearly, if a group, a nation state, a set of proxies or non-state actors are utilizing bioscience and technology in disruptive ways, one could argue that there may be some kinetic intent to that. But the nature of the operation, characteristically, falls below the thresholds of what is universally defined as hostile action for war. And so the reason that many of these types of things tend to be more in the what's called non-kinetic to kinetic gray zone is because even with attribution, relative retribution is problematic based upon proportionality, scaling, and what retribution would entail and obtain. So working in the non-kinetic zone, one could effect mass disruptive effects and manifestations without necessarily having direct destructive manifestations. But of course, the issue then becomes, do we need to reassess what those thresholds of kinetic engagement constitute, given the new capabilities that the biosciences, as well as the information sciences, may yield, and what represents the basis of disruption to destruction that has profound enough effect to be considered hostile acts of aggression for which there should be some retribution in proportionality.
And sanctions, yeah. And why do you think that such a non-kinetic war would be then followed by misinformation, by a misinformation campaign? Because people could not face a prion disease. Would that create chaos? Is that part of the misinformation? Yes. Why? Because I don't know if I spoke to a professor in one of my discussions about communication strategies, and we both agreed. Actually, he taught me and explained me that it's something you cannot communicate like that as a government. You need to find either a metaphor or a new reason why the people are suffering of this disease. You cannot say it's a neurodegenerative disease, because this might create chaos.
Well, it would certainly create a sense of panic. And when one examines the proverbial playbook of non-kinetic and even types of kinetic operations, an important consideration is something that has been referred to as the fog of engagement, or the fog of warfare. And such fogging, such intentional ambiguity, characteristically occurs by virtue of information provision that is inaccurate, or in some cases incorrect. Because what this then creates is, if you will, an information hiatus. It creates a stagnating of information that can then foster inappropriate responses, inappropriate capabilities, inappropriate readinesses. So what becomes very important to understand is the psychology of health public. In other words, is the public ready, capable, and competent to handle the information that they may be facing an epidemic of grand proportion, and that the nature of the epidemic is such that there may not be available treatment, or that treatments or mitigations are available only to some, and as a result, we're going to go into a triage mentality. So I will tell you, in 2009 and 2010, I had the privilege of working with many colleagues from NATO on an international exercise to develop what's called red, white, and blue teaming for hypothetical biowarfare scenarios. In other words, one group would be the aggressor, one group would be, if you will, the repressor, and the third group would essentially stand in oversight or referee. And one of the most important aspects of this type of disruptive engagement is the disruption of veridicable information flow. So by propagating a campaign of misinformation, very easily an aggressor could instigate and sustain information disconnectivity and communicative disconnect within a group, community, or a nation, sever the relative trust between the polis and those political structures that are there to protect the polis, and create not only relative panic, in which necessary resources, both financial as well as what we call organic resources of people, personnel, would be so overwhelmed in trying to respond to misinformation and its effects in the population that it would cause multiple disruptive manifestations across a variety of levels to essentially crash or disable not only the public health system, but very often the public safety system, mechanisms of national security. And what we recognize is that this can also create a diversionary manifestation in one area that then leaves a group, a collective, or a nation vulnerable in others.
Yeah, this aspect is very similar to what I read in an article written by Kendra Bechtel and Michael Gschwind, Ethics in Prion Disease. So it's basically the same, that it also deals with legal aspects. I mean, a person would not be liable for his actions in case of a prion disease. Today he might be liable and tomorrow not, and then 2 days later he might again be liable. So a sort of anarchic situation might occur if if we would be facing such a prion pandemic situation. So ethical aspects are of extreme relevance. Maybe any other disease as well.
As you know, our group, working together with others worldwide, have looked at the overall disruptive effect, any form of weaponized brain science that is able to influence, affect, change, or modify what would be the expected or normal cognitive, emotional, and behavioral functions of both targeted individuals and groups. If we look at the brain as at contributory to the essence of the self, consciousness, emotion, regulation, autonomy, and control. Anything capable of affecting the brain would then be capable of inducing changes in each and all of those domains and dimensions of human expression and experience. The question then becomes, what would be the ripple effects of essentially changing individuals' minds to affect their, if you will, hearts and souls? And what would be the manifest implications of that, not only in terms of their behavior, as capable of harm self or others, or incurring disability, but also the relative attributability of their behaviors. Would they be no eligible to work? Would their behavior no longer be eligible, for example, to be criminally prosecuted? Would this once again necessitate considerable investment, time, and effort of resources to ascertain whether or this individual's thoughts, emotions, and behaviors were due to an underlying neurological pathology, or was something that could be far more legally attributed? And do we have the techniques and technologies to do that? And the answer at this point is not to the extent leverageable within the scope of the law. So one of the reasons we're so concerned about the brain as a 21st century battlescape is the relative vulnerability and volatility of brain functions, of thought, feelings, and behaviors, and the ability to modulate those functions in ways that are both explicit and implicit, that therefore would have ripple effects in and across biological, psychological, sociological, economic, and legal domains.
So what do we know about spongiform brain disease from the medical history? I heard that it was Hippocrates, the first one to describe the pathology of this spongiform type of brain. Is that right?
Well, I mean, I think that there have been incidences described in the metaphorical literature that suggest that these types of spongiform encephalopathies have been present in humankind for a long time. Obviously, the accuracy of diagnosis is also dependent upon the advanced state of whatever is going to be the medical system that is using its currently available techniques and technologies. In other words, we're bounded by our understanding that there are a variety of pathologies that could affect the brain. Certainly, as a consequence of having more detailed examinations post-mortem, and also understanding what normal brain structure is to be able to become more insightful to what change brain structure would then imply for diseases that change neurological functionality. So realistically, although we may be able to see evidences might be neurodegenerative, inclusive of spongiform encephalopathies throughout much of human history, a real understanding of what these encephalopathies entail and obtain was much more realistically codified once the tools and techniques of post-mortem neurological examination became available and widely used in medicine and academia.
Actually, we know from Professor Prusiner, who discovered this proteinaceous infectious agents 1982, that he chose the name prion. I mean, you spell it like the bird, like the prion, but he said that in an interview published in a neurological publication 2018, he said it should be pronounced like prion and not prion. And that he was thinking of Edith Piaf. He said that he liked Edith Piaf a lot and he wanted the name to sound very funny and also catchy for in the world of academics. So he chose Prion. That name is somehow funny.
I think Prion rolls off the tongue a lot easier than Maurice Chevalier. I have no idea whether or not he was interested in Edith Piaf and the mellifluosity of Edith Piaf's songs, but certainly the word prion is fairly easy to use. And of course, as in so often, I mean, best use is easiest use. So, bravo.
It's quite interesting, since Hippocrates described the spongiform brain. He also practiced the trepanation of the skull. Do you know how Hippocrates' tool was called? It was the prion. A prion is in Greek a saw. A specific drill in order to open the skull is a crown drill bit, which is a prion. I read a very interesting publication by Italian osteoarchaeologists, and they were looking at some bones and skulls from dating back even to the ancient Egypt, and they explain about the prion, Hippocrates prion, which he used for trepanation. So it's actually a crown drill bit. And that's somehow funny. The pathogen agent, which maybe caused the spongiform disease back to ancient times, was partly treated with a trepanon. So archaeologists speak about the prion, and a neurologist speaks about Edith Piaf. That's somehow very funny. And it's also Professor Lieberman from...
my understanding... Yeah, I mean, so my understanding of how the prion was named, I had no idea that there was some reference to Edith Piaf and the mellifluence of her music and her... But my understanding is that the prions were named because of the reliance upon the antiquarian Greek word for something that punches a hole in something. So a prion, in its original use, was not so much a drill bit as it was really a punch. It was used like an awl, an AWL, an awl. And so a prion represents, it's a stick or some metal instrument that is used to punch a hole in something. And so here is this disorder, a manifest protein abnormality that essentially punches holes, in other words, has a prionic effect in the brain. So the spongiform nature of the encephalopathy is what is known as a prionic encephalopathy. It punches holes in the brain as a consequence of the activity of the abnormal protein.
Yeah, in this interview with him, I found no reference whatever to Hippocrates, nor to the prion or to the awl. But it's funny, this awl plays also an important role in Germanic mythology. It was Loki who had his lips stitched with an awl because he upset the gods. So prions also play partly almost a mystical role. And I read in Deutschlandfunk, they had a publication 2016, they spoke about the crown of the creator, because apparently prions are responsible for developing neurons and neuronal connections, if that's right, what I understood. So it's got also, beside the security aspect, prions also have a almost philosophical aspect.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. I mean, I think that like so many of the terms that we utilize in the brain sciences and medicine and in the sciences writ large, I think that some insight into why things named what they are named can be exceedingly important in maintaining their historicity, not just the history of the disease, but the narrative that goes along with these types of diseases, as well as the way that explanatory fictions that we call myths have propagated particular ideas that find to be problematic, troublesome, worrisome, and frightening. And so if we look to many of the great myths throughout history and in and across cultures, we see that many of us are populated with stories of individuals who lose their ability to communicate, who are alive but cannot act with others, or whose functions slowly degenerate, but as a consequence of that, they abuse either their position or their power. And so I think that long-standing human feelings years of diseases and the loss of capability have certainly been mythologized. And to this point, more contemporarily, what we're finding is that we're seeking to look at these explanatory fictions in part to gain some insight as to whether these diseases or these occurrences were present in antiquity, but to now study what these things mean through, if you will, a sociological, anthropological, and philosophical lens, so that we get a better understanding of how our biology affects our philosophies, our anthropologies, and our sociologies, and how our sociologies, anthropologies, and philosophies can influence and guide some of our biomedical techniques and technologies.
Yeah, the paper, coming back to the Prion, sorry for interrupting, it was a paper written by Professor Fabri and Lonce. Fabri is from the Department of Cultural Heritage from the University of Salento, Italy. And they made 2010 some discoveries, and there he explains what's actually what's a prion. And he said that Hippocrates used the prion, and he said that a prion is a hollow drill bit. So it's not a simple drill. It's got like a crown on the top, and because it looks like a saw, that's why Hippocrates apparently called it a crown drill bit, a prion. So yeah, it was the instrument to make a hole in the skull.
Yeah. So I mean, if we look at that type of an awl, it's not solid. The ending is open. And the reason for that is that then becomes not just a punch, but a true trephane. And so that's what a prion is. It is an awl with an open end, which we would call a crown drill, is open, which then allows an aperture, and that aperture can then be lifted out. And it's very interesting that the nomenclature for prion diseases brings that back to the fore, because if we examine the structural pathology of prion encephalopathies, in other words, these spongiform encephalopathies, what you see is just that. You see that originally you see this sort of punched out area of brain parenchyma, of brain tissue, that essentially hollows from the outside in. And in some cases, it looks very much where you would see one of those older antique tools. I mean, there are these large gaping sponge-like apertures in the brain that looks as if someone had gone in there with a crown punch and punched out the tissue. So aptly named.
So that was a sort of ancient neurosurgical therapy, which they applied for patients suffering of some spongiform disease in order to reduce the pressure in the skull. Was that the purpose of such a hole?
I think what we're doing is we're being far too retrospect generous. I mean, please understand that in antiquarian medicine, in ancient medicine, inclusive of that which was practiced by Hippocrates and the Hippocratic school of cause, there was still considerable feeling that the body was dictated and affected by what are called humors, fluids, and/or gases, and that misaccumulation of the humors in different bodily regions could then lead to abnormal processes of what are known as disease, right? And being able to then vent these humors was one of the staple practices of ancient medicine. So whether an individual was bled peripherally or, quote, vented via trephination was an attempt to stabilize the balance of humors and let bad humors out and let the body essentially heal from within to rebalance its equilibrium of these, quote, humors, which, of course, if we consider the technical and knowledge limitations of the time, in some ways was rather intuitive. I mean, recognizing that the brain was in a solidified case in which any change in pressure, whether it's due to humors or ghosts or processes more recently, would need to be vented or shunted. Clearly, and shunting, venting is still a standard procedure of neurosurgery. And so I think there is something to be said for the fact that although the underlying knowledge and the understanding was incipient, the utility of the approaches that were used were very often validated by what could be considered folk empiricism. In other words, individuals who were trephined very often survived because there was alleviation of the intracranial pressure, and in that way, a rehabilitation of neurological function, at least for a time, and therefore that technique of trephination gained not only in popularity, but in validity as something that worked.
What sort of tests do you have nowadays to detect prion contamination? I read something about a nasal swab for detection of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. Is that something which is performing very well, this nasal swab?
Well, I think the use of any viable peripheral biomarker to be able to assess the presence of a causative agent like a prion is a very important step forward. Yes, nasal swabbing coupled with co-registered forms of neuroimaging, coupled, for example, analysis, lumbar puncture, spinal tap. I think each of those has merit, but they gain more merit and capability when utilized together. And at present, as you know, that's how one would approach effective, meaningful doses of the presence of a prion disorder.
What about the zombie deers in North America and Canada? Some scientists say that this disease might spread to human beings. Others say, no, there is no reason to worry about that at all. What do you think? Is there a threat, or is it still something specialists are carefully looking at?
Encephalopathic diseases among deer populations in the United States?
Yes.
That's what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Well, that was a worry of ours as well. I think that the issue there is that infected deer that are then consumed as a household product, as a food product, as venison, might then have the risk of communicating this type of a disease into human populations. And of course, the incubatory period of human populations would be relatively long, a period of, as you say, at least a year if longer, which would then be problematic to identify what the causative vector of the disease was, so as to eradicate the vector. So there was and continues to be concern that these of deer-based diseases, encephalopathic in deer, might then be transmissible directly by consuming deer meat as venison. Not that there was going to be an interspecies jump, for example, that simple exposure to the deer would then communicate that to human species by virtual aspect of sort of niche co-occupation. As you know, here in the United States, deer are very, very common among a number of different neighborhoods. I actually, in my house, have deer in my backyard quite frequently. So the concern would be direct zoonotic spread by virtue of airborne contamination, but rather that deer that had an abnormal prion condition, that had these form of spongiform encephalopathy, would then be consumed by humans. And as you know, prion disorders are difficult to eradicate through traditional means of storage, chemical treating, or heat. And therefore, the vector would be one of a consumatory vector, not just a proximity vector.
We approach actually the end of our discussion, Mr. Professor Giordano. Thank you very, very much for participating here at Radio Gold in my talk show. And I think we learned a lot, and it was a great honor having you here, particularly, I think, the first American scientist and an expert in biosecurity, and particularly in the area of prion, to talk to us and to tell us so extremely important aspects about prions. It's a huge honor and pleasure having you here. Have a nice day. Thanks once more, and all the best.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Yes, sir.
Doamnelor și domnilor, l-ați ascultat în această emisiune pe James Giordano, expert în arme biologice, un oficial al armatei americane și al Pentagonului pentru combaterea acestor arme, care ne-a explicat foarte clar care sunt riscurile. Așa cum eu am citit printre rânduri, cred că ați citit și dumneavoastră cu ce ne-am putea confrunta. Precum am anunțat la începutul acestei emisiuni, este ultima ediție a emisiunii Lume în coliziune. Doresc cu această ocazie să vă mulțumesc, doamnelor și domnilor, pentru audiență, să mi-au rămas bun de la dumneavoastră, să mulțumesc în special domnului Cosmin Gușă, pentru că lui Cosmin i-a aparținut inițiativa de a modera această emisiune, firesc și patronului postului, Andy Gușă, colegilor de la regia tehnică, în mod special lui Cătălin, care cred că are un potențial excepțional să modereze emisiuni de sketch. Cu el pot să spun că am încheiat un fel de prietenie, chiar dacă nu ne-am văzut niciodată. Toate cele bune, vă doresc numai bine, multă sănătate și să nu uitați să vă mai rugați din când în când și la Dumnezeu. Iar cei care se simt ofensați de acest apel, cred că ceea ce am dezbătut până acum în emisiunile mele, fie n-au vrut să înțeleagă, fie nu pot să înțeleagă. Dar, din principiu, m-am adresat celor care au înțeles mesajul. Și firesc, doresc să mulțumesc și pianistei noastre și traducătoarei, în special lui Maria Alice, îi doresc mult succes în viitor și sper în continuare să mai asigure un program muzical la Radio Gold. Toate cele bune și numai bine!
Lumi în coliziune cu Radu Golban la Gold FM.